I know Rosie a little because we both volunteer on the project with the STA, which is the app we're building for volunteers to use to kind of get involved in projects. And one of the things that I have, amongst many things that I appreciated about kind of working with Rosie, is kind of bringing in like tools and systems and things that basically make what we do better, more stable, make more sense. So I didn't know about JSDocs until Rosie told me about it. So, but now I've seen the light. It's one of the things I didn't know I needed in my life, but now I know that I do. So yeah, over to Rosie. Really excited to hear your talk.
Thank you very much, Joe, and thank you all for coming. So let's talk about JSDoc, which I didn't really know much about until I started investigating it for the volunteer app. When we sort of, in one of the retros, it sort of became apparent that we wanted to document our code better. So I started poking around with it for things that could help us with that, and this is what came up, because the volunteer app is JavaScript based, and so this is sort of the obvious thing to do it. Sorry, I'm in the wrong window. There we go. So hopefully you can see these slides. So just to sort of expand on a bit on what Joe's already said about me. I have professional background in schools outreach and access to higher education. I was working until 2 years ago. I was working for a university computer science department, trying to enthuse young people about computer science and encourage them to study it, both in school and then on through to university. That was really, really good fun. So much good fun that I started drinking my own medicine, and getting interested in computer science and computing and development myself. And so I retrained as a developer. I was lucky enough to secure a trainee post. I had a little bit of coding experience, just dabbling mostly, and writing scripts to automate the boring bits of my own job. But then I did get a full-time trainee post, which was brilliant, and that turned into a more long-term gig, and it's with the same university I was working with before, but I'm working in one of the clinical trials departments, and I write software that underpins clinical trials and helps them to run smoothly. So it's in population health, so things like heart and renal disease. I know nothing about the scientific side, the medical side, but I do get to write code that supports the people that do. And when I was a trainee, I joined an Open University skills boot camp to sort of augment the skills I was learning through the trainee post. And that's how I ended up with the STA, because Joanna did a recruitment talk for the Skills Bootcamp. So it's all Joanna's fault. Thanks, Joanna, in her absence. So that's how I ended up here. And I've been working on the volunteer app since about July last year. That's me. So JSDoc then. I pulled up the definition of JSDoc from its own website, which is here. So what I should say before I get started is these slides are online, and I will pop the link in the chat. So if you want them, I'm just going to leave them up. They're on GitHub pages. I'll just pop that in the Zoom chat. So basically anything in blue in these slides is linkable, so that links out to this page, which is the getting started page for JSDoc that this quote's taken from. So it's an API documentation generator for JavaScript, and it's similar to JavaDoc or PHP Documenter. What does that mean? Basically, it will take your code comments, and if you write them in a particular way, it will scan your source code and it will generate stuff for you. I think this is actually quite a narrow definition. It's sort of underselling itself a bit here, because they're describing JSDoc, the tool that generates the HTML documentation website. JSDoc the term gets used to refer to a lot more stuff, so that just the style of comments and other things can use that style of comments. As we'll see, other tools can use that style of comments and use it to help you write your code. It mentions here JavaDoc and PHP Documenter. I'm not particularly familiar with either of those, but if you do use other ecosystems other than JavaScript, similar things will exist. So if you're using Java and the Java ecosystem, it's JavaDoc. If you're Python, it's PyDoc. I'm not familiar with PHP, but I guess PHP Documenter is the thing. The brilliantly named Doxygen is a good one for C++. Rust has this thing called RustDoc. Most modern languages will have something vaguely equivalent to JSDoc. If you're not a JavaScript developer, I can't promise that all the features will be the same across all of them or all the different ways of working with them, but they'll do similar things. So if you're not a JavaScript dev, go and look up whatever works for your ecosystem. Why should we use it then? Well, we should be commenting. Can we all agree that we should be commenting and documenting our code anyway? It's really good practice. It helps. Good, thumbs up. It's really good practice. It helps us to remember what on earth we did when we come back to it months later. It helps our reader to understand. It just makes the code clearer and easier to maintain. And JSDoc kind of gives some guidelines for things to include and suggestions, and it makes life easier for the reader or user of the code because it allows the IDE to supply the documentation in the right place, and we'll have a look at that in a minute. It can also help you with type hints. Now, last week Joe talked about TypeScript, and it was fantastic. If you haven't seen it, then you should watch it on catch up. Joe talked about TypeScript, and that does some similar things, and it actually does a lot more on TypeScript. And if I want type hints, I tend to go to TypeScript rather than to JSDoc. But if you have a project that doesn't have TypeScript involved yet, and it's all pure JavaScript, but you want some of the benefits of TypeScript without having to deal with all of the stuff that TypeScript entails, then you can get some of those benefits of TypeScript by using JSDoc, and just sort of, it's a nice halfway house. As the definition from the website mentioned, you can also get nicely formatted HTML docs generated from your code. And what it didn't mention is that you can also integrate it with other tools such as ESLint, which we'll have a look at in a bit. So then I'll just sort of dive into it, some examples. Basically, there are a few different ways of writing comments in JavaScript and TypeScript. You can write comments starting with a double slash. I've not shown that here. For some reason that would be a single line comment, but JSDoc won't pick that up. The other way of writing comments in JavaScript is to write /* and then finish your comment with // and then anything between the stars is your comment. It doesn't particularly matter how many stars you have for a normal comment, but if you want to use JSDoc, if you use 2 stars at the beginning there, then that is then a JSDoc comment. And JSDoc, if you or anything that looks for JSDoc comments will pick up those comments and use it. If it's 3 stars or 1 star or any other number than 2, then it will be treated as non-JSDoc. And that's a deliberate feature, I understand from reading the JSDoc website. It's so that you can disable the JSDoc stuff for a particular comment and say, ignore this one. You just put in an extra star or take out a star or something and it will ignore it. So then I'm going to use the volunteer app API as to get a couple of small examples, and we'll mark them up with JSDoc, and then we'll generate some HTML from them. So this one comes from the helpers folder in the volunteer app. I've got the volunteer app loaded up in code spaces here. If you're not familiar with the volunteer app repo, it's linked in the slides, and I've linked directly to the file that we're using here. It's got 2 npm projects in. One corresponds to the front end app, which is a React Native mobile app, and the other corresponds to the back end, the API. We're going to be looking at the API today because that's pure JavaScript, so there's a bit more benefit from using JSDoc to get the type hints that we would otherwise get from TypeScript. So I'm going to look at a file first in the helpers folder, and it's arrays.js. So that's the example that I just had up on the slide. There's no comments in this so far, but I picked it because it's a nice, small, fairly simple to understand function that we can read, understand it, and then we can mark it up. And if I hover over bits of it, it will tell me what it knows or can infer about the types. that are involved. So it knows that the function takes two parameters, array and chunk size, and it knows that it returns an array of some kind. The square brackets mean array. And if we read the code, we can figure out what it does. So it's taking the array and it's looping over, and it's starting with another array which starts empty, and it's looping over the input array in steps of chunk size. And for each time it steps through the array, it makes a copy of a slice of part of the array, which is of size chunk size, and it pushes it onto the chunked array. And then once it's done, it returns the chunked array. So what it's doing is it's splitting up this array, the input into array, into chunks. Basically, it's like paginating it. It's saying I want to make it into smaller arrays of size at most chunk size, and dividing it up and then returning an array of arrays which corresponds to parts of the original array. So that's what that one's doing. So that we don't have to read the code every time to figure this out, let's mark it up with some JSDoc. And VS Code, which is what Codespaces runs on and what you can use on the desktop as well, has really good JSDoc support. So already I've typed /*, and it already knows that I might be looking for a JSDoc comment. And if I hit enter there, then it sort of auto completes a skeleton comment for me, and suggests things that I might want to include in my comment to mark up this function. So let's write up what we just decided the function does. Takes an array and into smaller chunks of size and most chunk size. I say at most chunk size because there might be a smaller one on the end, and we could fine tune this wording, but just for demo purposes, I'm going to leave it at that. These brackets here, so these param lines are referring to the parameters that get passed into the function, and at the moment it doesn't know anything about the types of these. The thing in the curly brackets is going to be the type of that it expects into the function, and I can describe that as an array, and I can describe that one as a number because that's going to be a chunk size, and I can also add some notes about these ones. Input array, maximum chunk size, and I'm going to note that should be a positive integer, because if we get naught or negative, that's going to probably give us an infinite loop, which we don't want. So that's a useful note that we can add to the reader, to warn them, just in case -1 might get passed in or something. And this is where I can add any notes about the returns. I could add a type annotation there, but if I hover over this, then it's now picking, you know, before it was saying just any for both of these, it's now picking up the types that I've put in, and it's using that to better infer the return type as well. So I could put in the return type, but I don't technically need to. It will still do it. And you also notice that it's showing on this hover over, it's showing up the stuff that I've put into the comment. So that's pretty useful, and it will show up elsewhere. So let me just finish that off, and then I'll show what it does when you call the function. An array of subarrays, let's call it chunks. So that's that one more or less marked up. So what happens when we call this function? I'm just going to look for where it comes up. That gets used in projects.js. So let's look at it, and there it is. It's at the top of the file. If I hover over that, if I'm reading this bit of code and I want to know what this function call does, then I can now hover over that, and it gives me my JSDoc, which it wouldn't have done before, because it didn't know to associate the comment with the function, but now it does. So as soon as I'm reading, I don't have to go hunting in the code. I don't have to read what this function does. I can just see straight away, which is really nice. So just a slightly more complicated version, the equivalent of this. Let's have another look at a slightly different function. This one already has a comment which tells us what it does, which is really helpful, but it's just a single line comment. It's not a JSDoc comment yet. So let's turn it into a JSDoc comment. So we've got our skeleton one, and I can put that into there. Because someone's already written it for me. I'm looking at Joe. Is that you that wrote that one originally? Thank you.
It was. I'm now thinking, why didn't I do all these other things you're doing? Yeah.
You didn't know yet, probably. Maybe you didn't know the JSDoc was a thing yet. But
yeah, no.
Yeah, we've got it now. So let's sort of augment the comment. So we've got that. What does this function? Well, we've got from Joe's comment that it takes a record, and where Airtable has excluded fields that it thinks are empty, we need to repopulate them. So I guess it's taking a record, and I'm not quite sure what the record is, but I can see from the code that it looks like an object. It's got keys and values. So I'm going to type that as object. And I could even go as far as to say what type the string, to say what type the keys are, but I don't know what type the values are. So I'm just going to type that quite loosely, but I could go and tighten that up later if I found out more about what to expect from a record. The field definitions, what do we know about those? Well, we're looping over the entries of field definitions there. And we've got field name, which is the key, and field properties, which is the value. And here, field properties has a type, which might be array, Boolean, number, or string. So we know something about the field properties. So let's annotate this a bit further. And what I'm going to do is make a JSDoc type def. I'm going to do, if this was TypeScript, I would declare a type and call it field definition. I'm going to do the equivalent essentially for JSDoc. So I'm going to call it field definition. Field definitions, sorry. And I'm going to say that, let's get rid of, there we go. That it should have a property, and I think that should be, well, let's type it as string first, and it's going to be called type. So that's going to be that. So if I hover over that, why is that not saying? It's because I haven't said that this is a field definitions. So I can type that as field definitions now, and now that, no, it's not. Why is it not coming up? That should be a string. What have I done wrong? What have I done? Oh, field properties. That's what I want to do. I've got the wrong depth. So what I want to do is say field properties, which is the value type of field definitions. So field definitions should be of type with keys, strings, and values of type field properties. So now that should come up. We know that that's a string now, whereas it was coming up as any before. So it takes a while to get your head around what's nesting and where, and this is why we should document it so that we don't have to do this every single time. But that we now know that that's a string, so we can infer stuff about it. But if we wanted to tighten that up a bit, because we think it might be only a certain number of types of different strings, we can do what we would do in TypeScript. And if you were in Joe's talk last week, then this might look a bit familiar, because this is a union type. This is actually using TypeScript syntax for it. JSDoc will accept TypeScript types. It interopts with them quite happily. So I can say that this type field on the field properties should be one of these four. We might need others. I'm not sure from this code alone. I might need to go and look at, say, the Airtable API and see what the field definitions could be. But for now, I'm just going to type it as these four, and then know that if there is another thing that it could be, then we need to handle that. And now if I hover over that again, it knows that this should be of the right type, so, of the union type. So if I start auto-completing there, then it gives me the possible values that it could be. So that's a slightly more complicated example because we've got this sort of subsidiary type def, but it gives you a flavor of the sort of stuff you can do. You can be quite specific about what you want your object types to do. Okay, so that's sort of an example of how to mark things up with JSDoc. There are lots of things you can mark up with JSDoc. It's not just functions. So if I go to the JSDoc homepage and I scroll down, there are all these possible tags that I can use. I've only used the param and returns functions, tags in these examples, but there are so many that I could do. One that we use in the volunteer app is app file, and that gives you an overview of what's in a particular file. That can be quite handy as a sort of top level description. If you're writing JavaScript classes, then you can mark those up and mark up their members for whether they're private or public or read only or whatever. There's lots of stuff you can mark up. There's a very long list, and I'm not going to go through it. You can go and explore the JSDoc website if you're curious. There's lots of stuff, but just now I'm going to then go on to how to use JSDoc with, well, first to generate HTML docs and then to integrate it with ESLint so that it can tell you where it thinks you want more JSDoc comments. So JSDoc, the program, is what you want for generating HTML docs. And in order to install that in your project, you want this command here. So because the volunteer app has two projects in it, the API and the app, and I'm going to be working with the API in this talk. I'm just going to move to the API directory, and then I'm going to, doesn't like copy paste, and I'm going to type it npm install JSDoc, and I'm going to use the save dev flag. If you're not particularly familiar with npm, you might not have seen this before. If you want to get familiar with npm and Node, go and watch Doogie's talk in this series from 2 weeks ago, which is available on Catch Up and was really useful. The save dev flag, when you're installing the dependency in your project, tells Node and npm what to do with basically when you want that dependency to be useful. So if I look at the package.json, which is sort of the overview config file for the project, we have this list of dependencies here and this list of dev dependencies here. Now, the dev dependencies are things that we only need during development. We don't actually need them in order for the app to run, or in this case, for the API to run. Whereas these things are things that we do rely on at runtime. So Airtable, we need Airtable in order to actually run the API. Axios, which is to do with fetching things over HTTP, we need that at runtime. And Day.js, which is a datetime library, we're going to need that when we're running the API. Whereas these things in dev dependencies are thinking, yeah, this is to do with generating fake data for tests. This is to do with compiling. Jest is a testing framework. We don't need those at runtime, so they go under dev dependencies. And similarly, we don't need JSDoc at runtime. We don't need it to run the app, so we can use save dev and it will put it in the dev dependencies. I'm going to install it. And that should have, was it gone? Yeah, it's gone there. So that has now gone into dev dependencies and it's installed in our project as a dev dependency. And then I can generate an HTML by running npx JSDoc, and I'm going to give it a particular subfolder. helpers subfolder that I've just been working in to run against. npx is just npm's command runner, and then it will run the JSDoc command, and it will run it against the helpers folder. Ooh, it's complaining because I haven't put a value on that returns tag, so let's go and fix that. That returns the complete record once we've added in those empty fields that we didn't have before. So hopefully that should fix that error. That's happy now. Lovely. So what that's done is this green thing here is it's generated an out directory. And if I save that as on an HTTP server, what do I want to do? npx HTTP server. That should work, I think. Just going to start up a web server so that you can see the rendered HTML. Hopefully that you can see that. So I've not looked too much into how to actually template this HTML, but you can see it's got little links for each of the functions that I've just marked up. And if I click on one of them, then I get useful docs, which are nicely formatted. It tells me what parameters the thing takes. I don't think I added descriptions for those parameters, so it's not got them, but it's got that return description that I added in. And then it's got the stuff that I added in for the chunk function as well. If I want to see the source code, then I can click straight through to it. And that's the source code that we've just been looking at in the other window. So that now exists as HTML. We could make a website out of that if we wanted to. It's that easy. So that's one thing you can do with JSDoc, the program. I've not played too much with the HTML, I must admit, but if this is of use to you, then do go and explore it. It's all on the website. The other thing we can do with it is integrate it with ESLint, which is another tool. So ESLint, if you're not familiar with it, is a tool for improving your code quality. It will pick up annoying little inconsistencies in your code that make it look a bit less clean and possibly introduce bugs. It can pick up lots of issues ranging from the really minor, like there's maybe the indents aren't quite right on this, or the line break type is different between files, whether it's Windows or Unix, to more serious things that might introduce bugs. And it has a website, which is here, eslint.org, and that tells us how to install it. So let's run that now, and it's probably not going to like my copy paste again, but let's try it. I'm just going to stop that HTTP server because I don't need it anymore. But npm init eslint/config, and that should walk us through how to install ESLint in the project. And it's got quite a nice little installer that will basically walk us through how we want it set up, and it will do the initial config for us. So I'm going to go all in and say it should enforce code style, as well as checking syntax and finding problems. This project uses require type of imports and exports. It doesn't use any framework because it's a backend API. We're not using TypeScript. Our code runs in Node because of the backend. And all of these answers you can just answer for your particular project, or for whatever you're aiming to do and what your preferences are. You might want to use one of the given style guides. In this case, I'm going to answer questions about our code style so that you can see what that does. Let's accept the default for what format we want our config file to be in. I have no idea what type of indentation this this project uses. Let's find out. Looks like it's using spaces, so let's go with that. And then if there are any stray tabs somewhere, then we'll pick those up. What quotes do we use for strings? That looks like we're using single. What line endings? No idea. Let's go with Unix, and we can change it later if we want to. And it looks like we are using semicolons, so let's require them elsewhere. And then it asks, do we want to install the ESLint dependency? And let's say yes, and let's use npm. and that's now doing that. And it's generated a config file in the project folder, which is called eslint.rc.js, because we asked it for a JavaScript style config file, and that's got some sort of initial rules for ESLint to use. So you can see that it's picking up those from the questions that it asked us. So let's try running that against the helps folder to see what it does. There we go. So if I expand that a bit, then we can see it's giving us some. It's mostly just indents. There's going to be a lot of errors because this project has never been linted, so it's a little bit inconsistent, but it's mostly tiny little errors, and ESLint can actually automatically fix them if we want it to. You can run it again and pass the fix option on the end of the command. What I can also do is I'm seeing lots of instances of 2 spaces rather than 4, so I can actually just tweak the rule, and then if I run that again, then there should be fewer errors because it's picking up it's looking for 2 spaces rather than 4. So yeah, we can. Oh, now it's complaining where it's got 4 instead, where it's got 2 instead of 4, or vice versa. But never mind. Okay. So that's what ESLint does on its own. Now let's integrate JSDoc with it. So there is a plugin for ESLint. There are loads of different plugins and different rules that you can implement with ESLint. You can decide exactly what you want it to care about or not care about by just changing that config file. If we decide we don't want it to care about line break styles anymore, then we just remove that rule, or we can change it to a warning if we want, or we can change it to Windows. We can do whatever we want it to care about. So then if we want it to look at JSDoc comments for us, then we can install this plugin, and there's a GitHub page for it, which has got a really good README, and that'll tell us how to install it. So we've already installed ESLint locally in the project, and that will tell us how to install the ESLint, the JSDoc plugin. So let's do that now, and it's called ESLint plugin JSDoc. It's a bit of a long name, I can never remember it off the top of my head. npm install ESLint, I can't type, plugin JSDoc. And we're going to pass the save dev option again because we don't need this at runtime. And that's installed it for us. And we just need to do a little bit more config, which is in the instructions. And we need to tweak the config file to tell it to use this plugin now that we've installed it. So we need to tell it that we have the JSDoc plugin. So let me minimize that so I can actually see the config file. It's basically a JavaScript object with lots of options. So if I add in the plugins option and tell it to use that, then I can also tell it to use the JSDoc rules. So there's lots of different JSDoc rules that you can include. It has some recommended ones, so let's try those. And the good news is we don't have to copy paste all of this. We can just say extend this rule set and use the recommended ones. So I'm going to add that to plugin JSDoc recommended. I'm going to add that to my extends. Plugin JSDoc /recommended. So that should now be picking up our JSDoc issues as well. And if we run that ESLint again now, you see that it's complaining because we don't have enough comments in our code, and it tells us that we should fix them. So it's making it easier for us to make sure we have a minimum level of documentation of our code, which I quite like. It can get really annoying when you're trying to push something, but it's for our own good. So yeah, I find it actually more useful on the whole than annoying, but it's about finding the right balance and figuring out which rules you want it to use and what you decide to care about. I'm going to finish up, just chuck some resources on that last slide. The ESLint website that I've just been looking at, more useful JavaScripty stuff in VS Code that helps you to develop good code, and also just the main JSDoc website. I've just realised I've been totally missing the chat, but hi folks. Okay, if anyone's got any questions, do feel free to unmute, pop them in the chat, whatever, and thank you for listening as well. I'm going to stop talking for a second.
I guess just a quick question. I know that, so I'm currently at Code Clan in Glasgow, and I'm sort of learning, and I really enjoy these sorts of courses you do on Fridays. So thank you in general, first of all. But secondly, like, I can see the benefit for JSDoc incredibly for like these sorts of like maybe open source or like these sorts of team things where it might be like, I mean, the volunteer app is a perfect example, right? Where you have many different people. But as somebody who doesn't have any experience yet in like an actual, like maybe like a work environment or like a small agile team, is this the sort of thing that you can imagine they would use, or do they have their own documenting tools, or just do all their documentation manually, if that makes sense?
I don't know. I'm the only JavaScripty person on my team. I work on a team that does mostly data analysis. So we've got someone who's working in SAS, someone who's working in R. I do all sorts of things. I do whatever they ask me to do on any given week. It is useful, and I guess, but even just on my own, for when I've written a piece of code and I come back to it 6 months later, and I go, what does this do? I'm sensing that Joe feels the same pain. Do you want to come in, Joe?
Absolutely, yeah, like 100 times I've written something, I'm like, I entirely understand it because I'm like immersed in it, and then yeah, come back. I was just working on something recently, it was a year later, and I was like, and the pain of having to work out again. Yeah, definitely.
Absolutely. Yeah, even just sort of, a few months later, it's what did I do with this? Why does that do that? Why didn't I just write it that way? And then I change it and I go, oh, that's why I wrote it the other way.
Okay, cool. Well, that makes total sense. I'll definitely be integrating it into some of the things I've been doing, and I've already been playing around with TypeScript after last week. So thank you.
Good, well done. Yeah,
it helps anything. Sorry,
the tools. I guess people might develop their own internal tools. You develop whatever suits you, but you have this thing already built into most of the tooling, and it integrates with other tooling. So if this works for you, then you don't need to develop something else. You can just use this, but basically do whatever suits you.
I was going to say, I noticed my company actually uses a PHP documentator for all the old legacy stuff.
Okay, and find it useful, or?
I don't do PHP.
Me neither.
I'm JavaScript, but I've been, some of the stuff I need to look at as PHP or Angular.
Yeah.
So it's always fun.
Yeah, I've tried to carpet some of my internal work code with JSDoc stuff, and I don't use the HTML. The HTML is really pretty, and if you're trying to explain it to someone else, it can be quite useful to get just the comments without the code. For myself, when I'm actually developing, I tend to just use the hover over stuff. I'm looking at the wrong screen, sorry, but like the hover over stuff in the thing, so this sort of thing, where I can just hover over and get the docs right there where I need them. So I'll go back to that projects file where we were actually calling that function. Where was it? No, it wasn't that. Maybe I'm in the wrong file, but anyway, the hover over stuff. That's where I tend to use it. So I don't have to sort of flick back between two sources. But yeah, as I say, use whatever works for you. For the volunteer app, we've kind of used it as an automated nag, because it's in our PR guidance that we should comment our code. But we were finding that we were all a bit too polite about asking each other to do it. Whereas this is now built into our CI, and it nags you when you try and make a PR. It says you haven't. This is failing lint, and it's not got enough comments. So we've been using that as an automated thing to take the politeness out of it. It's like, no, do it now. So that's another way of using it to sort of human engineer, I guess. There's a term for that, social engineering of code commenting.
How did you?
Oh, sorry, Joe. On you go.
Just going to ask, how did you? Maybe just briefly, let Rosie. How did you set that up, the automation? Like maybe not in detail, but just did you need an external service, or was it just like some configuration in GitHub? Or
so we used GitHub Actions. So it's actually in here in the thing, and it's not set up on the API yet. But basically, I forget the details of how this works, but what we did with the app side of the volunteer app, the front end, the React Native, is we added a workflow, and it's this bit of code here if you want to poke around with what it does. So when you make a, what does it do? Does it run on push, or I'm just seeing what it does. It's on pull request, I think. But when you make a pull request, it runs the tests for the app, but it also runs the lint checks. And because we introduced it quite late on in the game, lots of the app was unlinted, and so we're gradually linting it. So the command is a bit more complicated because we want to lint only the files that are changing in a particular pull request. So this command is a bit hideous and complicated. But basically that's the aim of it. It's to get just the files that have changed and lint those. So every time we change it, when we change a new file, it gets linted and corrected. So we gradually clean up the code base. If you're starting a new project, then you don't need this complication. You can just lint the whole project on each pull request, say. It's in there. I'm not an expert on GitHub Actions. This was basically the only thing I've ever done in GitHub Actions, because I actually use GitLab at work, which is mildly different. But if you want to poke around with that, then that's where it is. It's in the .github folder in the volunteer app repo. And if you've got questions, then just ping me on Slack.
Cool. Thanks for explaining that. Yeah, because I just found the automation super helpful.
Good, thanks. Okay, any more questions?
Sorry, Martin, I interrupted you before.
It wasn't a question. I just wanted to kind of second what Kelsey said earlier, that it's really helpful to keep the track what you're doing. Like Rosie said that too, and you too, Joe. And I'm speaking from the point of a kind of beginner developer. So like at the beginning, I didn't know about this. So I was just writing a comment. Okay, I'm writing a function or something. So I would do a comment. Okay, this function does this. And it's already something like JSDoc, which is designed to basically help us to do it, you know. Plus you would add the like params and you would add what it returns. Also, you would describe a little bit what type of data it takes in, like Boolean, or let's say number, or if it's a string or maybe array, you know. So it's a good description and a good kind of a tool to use, I would say.
Yeah, the type stuff is so helpful. I think I learned JavaScript originally, and then I learned TypeScript, and I went back to trying to write JavaScript, and I couldn't write JavaScript anymore because I couldn't cope with it. I'd got spoiled by the types. I love having strong types that I can use to figure out what I'm supposed to be passing to this function and what I can expect back from it. I love the integration and just the ease of use that gives me. So anything I can do to introduce that into a code base is a good thing in my book.
Yeah,
fully paid up TypeScript fan. But yeah, as I say, the best way to do the type checking, in my opinion, is TypeScript. But if you can't get that into the project, then, or you don't want to for whatever reason, then this is a nice halfway house. Okay. I think everyone wants lunch. So yeah, thank you all for coming. If you have any more questions, then as I said, or especially about like the GitHub stuff or anything else, then do just Slack them. And yeah, have a good Friday, everybody.